Welcome back, everyone who's joining us online. We're now moving into session 10 of the People's Inquiry into the housing crisis. And in this session, we're going to explore the impacts of the housing crisis on regional communities and businesses. Each of our speakers will have 5 minutes to share opening remarks with us, which will be followed by questions from the Honourable Doug Cameron and myself as commissioners, and we will ask those questions based on what you've shared in your written submission, as well as the perspectives that you share with us here today. And at the conclusion of this session, I'll summarise to the best that I can what we've heard, and we'll draw it to a close. But before we get started, let me acknowledge and thank all of our speakers for being here today. And I do want to remind all of our participants that some of the topics that we cover might be difficult. We can take a break, of course, at any time. And of course, if you need to pause or turn off your camera for any reason, please feel free to do so. So we'll now turn to the first speaker on my list, which is Rowena. And Rowena, I can see that you're muted.
Hi, I've just unmuted it. Hi. Okay. So I've decided to leave my camera off just because of the way I am currently living. I don't feel comfortable with it on. So okay, so firstly, I just wanted to talk about the circumstances that have led me to, I think, being extra susceptible to the impact of the housing crisis. So I say extra susceptible because I'm actually currently living in a tent and I actually have been for quite some time, about 6 years. I noticed in my submission, I said I was living in a caravan, and then later I said I was living in a tent. So I think I made a bit of a mistake there. It's actually a tent. So I'll talk about, what this is like a bit later on, but first just a bit about what has led me to this situation. So although the housing crisis is systemic, obviously there are people who are more vulnerable, who have had something happen in their lives, so end up on a low income and get stuck in the cycle of poverty. I myself developed a long-term illness 25 years ago. I suddenly developed chronic fatigue when I was about 33. Yeah, it was, I had, and it's continued, like many debilitating symptoms, they've all continued, like severe muscle spasticity, which limits my movement, along with pain and extreme weakness that comes and goes, and various other symptoms which come and go. And in general, it's unpredictable. So I've gone through months at a time when I haven't been able to do anything at all, really. And other times it's been a bit better. So just to, I'll just, just to explain, what my physical situation is. So as a result of this, what I did was I was only able to work minimal hours. So basically, most of my life, I've been on a very low income. I'm 58 now, so it's really only been about 10 to 12 years of my life in which I could work full time. And so it wasn't until about 10 years ago that I went on disability support allowance and continued any work. So that's a bit of the background. So I'll just explain also that I do have some savings, but the amount is, it's very low, and it's over the amount which makes you eligible for public housing. So So just to explain a bit about where I've lived, I used to live in Melbourne when I first got sick for a couple of years, and then I realised that um, living in regional areas made a significant improvement to my health. So I lived in various areas, living in both granny flats and sharing with other people. And eventually I moved back to Sunshine Coast, Queensland, and started living in the town which I actually grew up in, which is where I am now. And so just to keep this a bit more anonymous, I won't, name where it actually is. It's just a small town. So my housing difficulties really have gradually got worse for me over the years as rents have gone up and my income has only gone up slightly. It was when I moved here to the place I currently live about 10 years ago that my housing situation became almost impossible. When I moved here, really everyone on low income had housing problems. So it's been going on for longer here than in other places. Um, and house prices were going up very quickly for rentals. And so I shared with someone for a while. I lived in two granny flats until, the rent kept going up. And where I was, they wanted me to sign a 12-month lease and after putting the rent up, and I wanted only a 6-month lease as I wanted to try and find somewhere else. But, because I wouldn't sign a 12-month lease, they evicted me. So that's when I decided to try living in a tent it's actually, at that time, there was quite a few other people that I was aware of other people doing that, living on other people's land in caravans and tents. So that's why, I thought, and it was meant to be only temporary when I first did it, but really, so since then, like that's kind of when COVID hit and the housing crisis hit and rents just went up. I mean, it just absolutely got worse overnight and became a situation where there was just almost no rentals available at all. So I basically had to remain here. Um, so um, uh, so basically what I've noticed since, the housing crisis, is that this way of living has increased exponentially in this area and in other areas of the Sunshine Coast. Um, so basically, I just wanted to talk about this because it is such a significant thing, how many people are living in this way in this area. So people live on someone's property, in a caravan park or in a private camping place like a U camp or hip camp or something similar. Um, or they're living in their car or in a van. And so mostly live in caravans or tents, a camper van, or in some cases a tiny house. But basically, because, there really is no choice because there are no rentals, and mostly it's low income people, but now it's very common for middle income people to live this way. And also, like, even people with full-time jobs, like where I am now, there's 3 people with full-time jobs who are living in this way because that's how bad it is. So so just to talk about that way of life, it's very difficult. It's kind of it's okay for people who are very healthy and do have a bit of money behind them so they can keep maintenance up on whatever kind of dwelling they've organized. But there's quite a few older people and unwell people like myself, and um it's really difficult. You just cannot get on with anything else in your life. Always dealing with cleaning and maintenance, and it's an ongoing struggle. So and this situation seems to be even getting worse in this area. I've noticed, it's becoming more and more people living in this way. So I guess I just want so now talk about what I see sets regional areas apart from city areas. What I've noticed, the difference between regional areas and city areas, or what I've noticed about like the people around me who are are not able to find anywhere to live, is that they have a similar demographic to me, like they are single persons, or there's a lot of single parent families actually, and they're mostly older people, but some are middle-aged and some young. But I mean, I don't really know compare with other areas, but in my area, it's really is basically single people and single parent families around me. Um, and so what I've noticed from moving from the city is that there's much more of a lack of diversity of housing choices. Like there's very few, so units are only in a very select area. There's less of them. Um, so there's really no housing for single persons and single parent families. And the other thing I noticed is that the quality of housing in regional areas or where I've moved to is I noticed is less good quality, and a lot of the rentals are basically is very substandard. Like when I was actually still looking at rentals, there was quite a few like little dwellings, makeshift dwellings for single people. And I mean, that was what was available. And, um, things like that obviously weren't council approved. And like they didn't even have a kitchen or a kitchenette. And they were charging like, um, the price of a unit. And so even back then, people were starting to kind of capitalize on the fact that people were desperate and charging people for um, these really bad living situations. And I know a lot of people who are renting are living in these kind of um, substandard dwellings. And I guess the other thing I've noticed, like there's a kind of been a trend to try and start sharing in my area. And I have tried to do that as well. But what I've noticed as well is that a lot of even the houses just are very small and not suitable for sharing because the larger houses have been taken up by Airbnb. And so, and also, other serious problems like, there's a lot of substandard houses as well. So, I mean, just to sum things up, like overall, the main priority to solve the housing crisis is, of course, policies to lessen and turn around the impact of the problem of housing having become a vehicle for wealth accumulation, like, you know, tax reform, increasing public and social housing, tenants' rights reforms, and I think also the consideration of rental increase restrictions. But I thought, looking at it from a regional perspective, and maybe in the city as well, but what needs to be looked into as well is getting the right mix of housing to appropriately fit the demographic in different areas. And I think this has been a focus a lot in city areas, but little has been done to address this in regional areas.
Rowena, thank you so
Oh,
much.
yeah.
We are going to come back to you. I'm just watching the minutes tick
Oh,
away.
sorry.
No, don't apologize. I mean, your comments are so insightful, and I thank you very much for sharing those perspectives with us. But as I said, we will come back to you
Okay, thanks.
in a moment as well. I just want to now turn to Jenny, who is next on my run sheet, and Jenny, to give you an opportunity for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Nicole. I hope that's coming through clearly. I did sit through the earlier presentations this morning, and I feel humbled from first speakers who really brought home some of the disadvantages and systemic policies that many people face. I am affected by the housing crisis, but I do not face many of the extraordinary challenges that other people are. In the initial survey questionnaire, the Commission talked about housing stress for spending over 30% of income on housing. As far as I'm concerned, the amount spent is not relevant. I'm housing stressed purely because I have struggled to find a house. Yet shelter and safety that comes from shelter are core human needs. Over my working life, I moved routinely. I never planned to buy a house. I moved for work. You spend a couple of weeks in temporary accommodation and then you move into a rental. I had planned to rent into retirement. And I do have planned. I had self-sufficient investment and super income that was going to meet rental and living costs well into retirement. But my experience since 2020 shows that expectation is no longer a possibility. My story, a bit like that of many, starts with COVID. I was working in Timor-Leste in a community organisation. I was returned to Australia as borders closed and flights ceased. I was quarantined in one state, had to wait months for borders to open to be able to return to Queensland, where my car and other possessions were in storage. I really, at that point in time, had no idea what would eventuate, so you find yourself waiting. I did not register with Centrelink because I was at that stage more optimistic. Given the uncertainty, I didn't want to commit to a 12-month lease, and I did not meet the requirements for most of your on-market leases, in which was a market that was already very, very tight. I didn't have an income statement from employer. I'd stopped working when I left Timor. I didn't have evidence of a recently paid Australian utility bill. I didn't have a landlord's reference. I couldn't pass go. So after about 6 months or so of wondering what was happening, I accepted a fixed-term contract in Kununurra in the Kimberley. I expected I would find a rental. And I think I was naive at that point in time. I initially stayed in what is loosely termed workers' accommodation. I graduated eventually to a second-hand caravan with a short hike to toilet and bathroom facilities. I was seriously considering walking away from the job because I really wasn't happy with my living situation. But the borders into WA were closed, and anyway, I eventually found what I will call on-farm accommodation. Far better housing than many people I knew, and I stayed there for 2 years. For those of us that go to places like Kununurra, who are used to being in reasonably middle-level professional work, dongas, caravans at the rear of industrial sites, or on-farm accommodation is the norm. Unless, of course, you're a government worker, because that's the twist. The government departments provide housing and keep several vacant properties so they can offer incoming staff a choice. But none of that's available for non-government workers. I had learnt back in 2021 that it was easy to find work in remote and rural Australia, but very difficult to access housing and servicing. I could have stayed in Kununurra, renewed a contract, taken on a different role, but I decided to return to Queensland because of the lack of access to services. This was brought home by having to drive to Darwin 1,000 kilometres for a 10-minute bone density scan. Although, of course, the WA Health Department being State-based recommended travelling to Perth, 3,000 kilometres away. It's not a situation I really wanted to be in long term. And should I break a bone or something worse happen, there is totally inadequate support in remote areas as you age. In the sort of situation that everyone is in places like Kununurra, you find yourself wondering what came first, the chicken or the egg. Employers are really struggling to find workers. Workers are keen to take up the work, but are unable to relocate because they cannot find housing suitable for themselves or their families. Some families would happily relocate, but they rely on two incomes and they can't access childcare because there's a shortage of childcare workers, because the childcare workers can't afford to live, because there's no rentals. It's this ridiculous cycle without a beginning and at the moment without an end. I moved on because I felt I didn't want to put down roots as I got older because of the lack of services. There are parents whose children have diverse needs and couldn't access the support services they need. Overall, the lack of housing and inadequate access to services totally disrupt regional economies. The cost of building in remote areas is prohibitive. There's empty block of lands in Kununurra, but the additional cost of materials to build make it quite unrealistic. Since leaving Kununurra, I've spent 6 months in North Queensland, sometimes house sitting and sometimes visiting friends and family. A couple of times I've helped/camped on volunteer work sites. I no longer have any expectation of finding a rental and have decided to use my super savings to buy a house. Yes, the irony is I am privileged. I can afford to buy a house. People over 60 are rarely eligible for bank financing. And so many people in my situation are those people that live in vans and cars and no longer have a home. In the current market, buying is presenting its own challenges. Affordable properties are usually sold before being listed on the internet, and there's very few that are on the market for a week. After 6 months of making do, I have just signed a contract to buy a property. In another 6 months, I'll be able to move into it and meet societal expectations of having a fixed address. With a fixed address, I will be able to pick up some work, update my records, join in community, and build new contacts. For me, it feels a positive resolution. The irony is that in buying the modest house I am pushing 2 renters onto the rental market. Their lease will end at the end of the year when I move in. Something I would like to add is there are some real realities for people that are with no fixed address. The system forces us to create white lies. When we access most government services and private services, we have to identify ourselves with an address. Think of your car registration and insurance, vital for people that don't have fixed addresses. Think of Medicare, think of banking. The first step is always to give your name and your address. For more formal purposes, proof of address is provided through an electricity account or a rates notice or a lease agreement. I have none of these. So I resorted to making things up. And all the white lies sit uncomfortably with me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Very powerful story that you shared. And now if we can turn to you, Rebecca.
Okay, so yeah, so my story is a little bit different. I'm an engineer. I've spent 25 years working in industry at various large corporations, and I went back and completed my postgrad. I did a master's, and then after that, I went on to do a PhD. After 15 years of owning a mortgaged property, I entered the rental market approximately 2018. And, you know, that was after a marriage ended. So I know that it was easy at one stage to get into a rental because I did it. And late last year, I was offered my dream postdoc job, which required me to relocate interstate. My youngest had just finished high school, so I was kind of free to move. And I thought, well, I'm in Victoria and I need to move to another state, so I'll have to get maybe someone to help me who's on the ground, and I employed a rental advocate to help me out. So I would stay in Victoria and pack everything, and they would be up here looking for something, but we decided we'd do that at the start of the year because otherwise, can you hear me now? Hopefully that's better.
There is a little bit of
yeah.
static.
Okay. Should I? Look, I might be able to take off the headset, but I'll try and stop moving so that you can. Is it clearer now?
No, I think maybe if you could take off the headset.
Yeah, no worries. I'll do that now.
It might be a Bluetooth issue. We can't hear you though. Oh, now we can.
Yeah, all good.
That's
Okay.
crystal clear. If you're okay with that, that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want me to restart just quickly?
No. We could definitely hear you, but this is better.
Yeah. So I started effectively looking at the January start with someone helping me, but I hadn't actually come up here until 4 weeks later. And I moved into temporary accommodation provided by my employer, but I would only have like 4 weeks of that lined up. And after that, I definitely had to get out of the accommodation. So, I was leaving Victoria, having lived in a house, and I knew that coming up here, I wouldn't be able to afford a house. So I was only just looking for a 2-room flat. So, and one of the issues that I found is being a single person is that you're in a bit of a disadvantage because you're on your own. People don't want to give you a rental because they're worried if something was to happen, you wouldn't be able to pay rent. And as part of that, I was asked to show that I had a significant amount of cash reserve in my bank. But, in the end, it didn't really help anything because, you'd put in all the applications, I'd still get rejected. So to the point where, I had to give away my cat to my sister for a period because I knew that would have been probably putting me at the end of the list as well. So 2 weeks into my accommodation, I kind of started panicking, and I thought, you know what, I have to come to the realization that I just might not be able to find anything. So I started looking for a room to share in someone's place. And that took me 2 weeks because you want to find someone who's like, a fit for you. And I found something the day before I had to get out of my temporary accommodation. So I was pretty thankful. Otherwise, I would have had to hightail it to a hotel for a while. So really just, after 2 months of searching and great anxiety and stress, it really is a stressor. Here I am leaving a whole house that I was renting, coming up to share a room and thinking to myself, have I really made the right choice? This might not be the best thing I could have done. And then finally, my rental advocate, he had a nice couple who had a nice rental, and they were looking for someone to rent. And through him, I was able to obtain a place to rent, which is my 2-bedroom flat at the moment. So thankfully, I had someone helping me, but I know that not everyone else has that opportunity. No, and you know, not everyone else earns the average wage. So I'm lucky I earn a little bit more, which is, you know, apparently it's around the 100K mark. So, you know, like if you don't have the cash reserves and you're earning a good wage, like, and you're single, where are you, you know? So just the personal impacts that it had on me were stress and anxiety. All of my things were in storage. So I felt like I was in a constant, you know, pattern of circling. Like I couldn't like actually get on with my life. Yeah. So I'm a professional and I found this whole experience highly overwhelming and stressful. And, you know, it takes a bit of a personal toll. So just in summary, I would say being single is a disadvantage, you know, and it can end up, you feel pretty hopeless. Like you can control you and do everything that you need to do, but the market is up to everybody else. Yeah. And so just, you know, I think I would say that safeguards are required for renters before the situation gets even worse, you know, and if no action is taken, then I would say to someone who wants to move for a job, like I'd be like, it's going to be really hard for you to find somewhere, you know, you're going to be stressed and you might not be able to find anywhere to stay for quite a while. And just from a personal note, like my background is in engineering and I see this whole issue as a problem that needs to be solved, and there are engineering tools that we can use to solve these problems, you know, so I know that this is a solvable problem, you know, things just need to change.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Rebecca. And you really highlighted that the regional housing issues in particular and the lack of available and diverse and appropriate and affordable rental stock in regional areas and what it means then for people, you know, aiming to get into employment. I'm going to hand over to Doug to ask some questions now in the 20 minutes that we've got left of this session.
Thanks, Nicole, and I'll go through it as we had the people putting their questions. So, Rowena, I might start with you. So you've been 6 years in a tent.
Yeah, that's right. Long time. Very long.
So, and what I was, you know, interested to hear, there are so many other people living in the same way. So is the tent on a caravan park?
Yes, my situation it is, but it's actually it's a caravan park which isn't allowed to have long-term people because the councils they tried, but there's very few in Queensland. So I guess so then I mean apparently so the council has put out an amnesty so people can stay long term in caravan parks, but there's still I guess it's still very insecure, and we I think probably the most difficult thing is that we're so vulnerable to you know how whatever the owners want to do, and there tends to be we tend to be treated a bit like they an underclass in a way, like so that's very difficult.
So you indicated that because of your circumstances you've got low savings. If you had to move from and hopefully that doesn't happen soon, but if you had to move, how would you finance the move?
Well, so do you mean like, well, the worst part would be just paying rent and
Mm.
bond. I don't have many things that I own, so that part is not too difficult.
So
Um,
no big moving expenses.
well, really, yes, the moving expense. I have a van, and it would be the cost of bond and rent. So, but basically, there really isn't any rentals in this
Mm.
area, and and from what I've noticed, it seems to be it's only like way out west there is any, it's easier to rent still. So yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, the Sunshine Coast, you get some mild weather at certain times of the year, but you would have significant humidity and heat to deal
Mm.
with in a tent. How is that managed?
Well, I guess I'm very well set up. So it's actually a tent that's it's a bell tent. It's a bit similar to a yurt. So it's not as
Mm.
bad as it sounds, but I know there's other people in, more makeshift tents. Um, so really that is a difficult part, but I do have a heater and a cover over it so it's not too hot. But
Yeah.
really that is the difficult part, is like when it rains and like everything is kind of there's so much work to do. That it's the most difficult part. And then you can't kind of do other things to get yourself out of the situation. So
So how did you manage? Can you just give me a bit of an idea how you managed to find a tent and and get into a tent? I mean, I'm just a bit bemused about how you do something like that.
oh, really? Well, I bought it.
Yeah.
Um, oh gosh. Um, so well, I mean, I guess maybe it's kind of different. I mean, I know there's people that live in tents in the city in parks, but around me there really are quite a few people doing this sort of thing, and so we
Yeah.
talk to each other and help each other, and
Right. So you've got a bit of a community that you're in.
yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely a community of people here. Yeah.
Right.
So um so here I think there's like three others living in a tent, and
Mhm.
about four caravans, two tiny houses, a couple of people in a car, and someone in a camper van. So
Yeah. Yeah. And
that's
you have access to transport.
yeah.
What if is there people there with no access to transport?
There is a couple, but they're like very fit people,
Yeah.
so they get lifts. There is one person who's older whose their car's broken down. I mean, this kind of thing happens, and so it has been very traumatic for him for a while, and so things like that that is a problem, because everything's kind of spread out. Um, I guess that's kind of part of the difficulties of working things out.
Yeah.
Like, for example, we didn't have water for a few days, and so yes, that's
So you base it. So is it like lots? I've been in caravan parks myself, but on holiday basically. So you share um, shower
y-
and the like, or do you have
yeah.
one? So it's just a shared approach.
So there's an amenities block, and there's a camp kitchen, but
Right.
I guess I've set up, an outdoor kitchen for myself so that because, I need to have ease of living.
Yeah.
So
It certainly it certainly doesn't seem to be the, whereas you're managing,
yeah,
but you do, and it's just managing, isn't it? It's not.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's the, yep.
And you said it was creating stress. Does that affect your physical health?
Yes, I definitely think it does. Yeah. Um, and yes, I do notice that other people struggling and it affecting their physical health as
Yeah.
well. So, it's how it sounds. It's a very difficult, and I do, but I do suspect there's people worse off, who are just living in their cars and they don't have access to a caravan park. And yeah, so we're not the worst off, but it is living, really you're just surviving, and that's the kind of the biggest problem.
You're
Yeah.
being very stoic, I must say, but I might have to come back, but I think I need to move on to Jenny now.
Okay.
Look, thanks for that. That was really interesting listening to how you're handling this, I must say.
Thanks.
Jenny, is Jenny there?
Yes, Doug, I've just unmuted.
Oh yeah, no worries. Thanks, Jenny. So you've got a somewhat different, set of circumstances. Everyone's got their individual circumstances, but I'm interested in this issue about after COVID having difficulty finding accommodation because you didn't have, a work record at the time. How difficult is that?
If you are going to rent through an agent, there are a whole lot of things you have to provide. They want to see that you're earning regular income. Like Rebecca, I have been able to show I've got savings, but that's not really what they want. They want you to have a reference from your previous landlord. My immediately previous landlord was in Timor and didn't speak English. He wouldn't have understood what was required. Anyway, there's many things that you have to provide as part of your application. And if you cannot meet that expectation, they're not even going to consider your application. It's the sort of thing Rebecca's found. Like Rebecca, I consider myself a professional. I've never had problems in the past. When you relocate for work, the standard process, you find a rental in a couple of weeks, it's no problems. But at the moment, there is nothing to rent. I think Rebecca's very lucky she found something, because I haven't.
I had help.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you've got similar stories, really, and experiences, but with different outcomes. So, has this affected your mental situation or your physical situation? All this stress on finding accommodation.
I'm a very stoic person and a very robust person. That is possibly my advantage. And I have had friends and family to fall back on. Certainly affected me when I was at stage 2 in Kununurra, which was a caravan.
Yeah.
I really hated if I had to go to the toilet in the middle of the night. You either have a little bucket in the caravan with you or you go for a few 100-metre walk. It wears thin after a while.
Yeah.
But I was when I moved to my farm accommodation, which meant I had my own facilities. I was no longer going to, that was fine for me. It didn't have to be flash. In the current situation where I'm house sitting a bit and I've always had friends and family I can fall back on when there's a gap. I don't like thinking I'm staying months on end with friends and family, but if I have a week's gap, that's what I've been doing. It's demoralising.
Yeah.
And I guess it's not where I thought I would be.
So, yeah, it's really a terrible situation where, you know, most people think that if you're homeless, then you don't have funds. I mean, you're poor. But now this is professional. People are experiencing this as well. You do indicate in your submission that the governments need to do more, and they should stop relying on the free market. Do you want to just explain that a little bit?
In my perspective, I compare the situations we're in today with when I was younger. Somewhere along that time continuum, governments stopped planning. They stopped saying, you know, we're going to work, we're going to have to build dams, we're going to have to put in power stations. They privatised and made the assumption that the private sector would meet the market's need. That clearly is not the purpose of the private sector, and it hasn't happened. So today, compared with, say, 40 years ago, we're more likely to have a blackout. And I grew up in rural New South Wales, far west, south of Broken Hill, north. We are more likely to have a power blackout now than we were 40 years ago. Water issues, water supply, teacher shortages, nursing shortages. It's no particular government. It's no particular political sphere. They just stopped planning and decided the private sector would do this, and they sold assets, which is part of the problem in the housing situation. And then what really brought that home to me was last year when on the news, the population of Australia is already at the level they expected for 2050. Somebody has really fallen short on planning. Multi-sectoral, not just housing, across the board, and for probably about 30, 40 years.
Yeah. Now, look, again, we might come back, but looking at the time, I think I need to move on. Really, thanks very much. That's been really illuminating for us, for you to explain the position you're in. Can we move now to Rebecca? Thanks, Jenny.
Yep.
Hi, Rebecca. So, like Jenny, you're a professional. You've got a master's and a PhD.
I'm still finishing my PhD technically.
Still finishing it, yeah.
Piece of paper.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
And you know, you're saying you earn in the region of 100,000.
Yeah, I'm not quite there because I basically had to go back to being a graduate.
You've got, but you still get problems. You've got a PhD. You've done what, you know, people always argued, that if you study hard, you get a job, you know, everything will be okay. But it's not like that anymore, is it?
No, I get the feeling the system's kind of broken. So, but I understand also at the same time that the system is very complex. So it makes it really hard for people to understand what they need to do to fix it. And coming from my background, you know, I can explain it in easy ways, which is what we've got is a whole bunch of symptoms of the system not working. And we have to take those symptoms and turn them into what is the actual root cause that is at the basis of those symptoms. And you have to separate the two. You can only ever fix a problem at its root cause level. So, even to sit down and say, well, what's broken, what's not working, it's going to take a lot of effort, because even from just this conversation, hearing everyone's experiences, there are a lot of things broken, a lot. And it needs to be optimized as a whole system. We can't just tinker on the edges. Tinkering on the edges is what got us here, because they didn't have at the core what is the function of our housing. And I would say it's to put roofs over people's heads. It's not to make other people rich,
So you would agree with some of the arguments we've heard during the commission, that housing should be about a home, not an investment?
Totally. It's ridiculous to say that that's how we get rich. We just buy a house. Even from an industrial point of view, we should be leaving that up to our businesses to make money. If you want to make money, go and do a valuable service in the community. Go and build a valuable product that we can use. That's what we should be investing in. Investing in housing is technically a bubble last time I looked.
Look, I wonder if I may ask a question.
Sure,
Doug, I know you're never going to run out of questions either, but I'm really keen to know, particularly from you, Rowena, but Jenny or Rebecca, this may be something that you've got insights to share. But Rowena, what types of support have you tried to access, or have you been able to access, and has helped or hasn't helped?
It's a good question, because I've often felt like I was just outside of, what the support was, the sort of people that the support was available for. So so I guess I haven't been able to access much, but so for example, it took me a long time to go on disability support, because I wasn't I didn't want to, actually, because I wanted to remain, in the workforce. But also, like, once I became homeless, things like NDIS or help, carer help, isn't available for someone who isn't actually in a house. So often, like, I mean, it's just that's just bizarre, like, there isn't much help for people with a disability even to, have a house. And then, so I don't know, there's a mismatch in the services, and seems like the basic thing that people need that would solve a lot of their problems, which is housing, it needs to be talked about in the same context as other support for people. And if people's housing was sorted out, then all sorts of other problems would be sorted out, like, it would help with domestic violence, and so
I'm mindful of time, but Rowena, I did want to ask, I mean, look, social housing waiting lists are long, but for instance, if you applied for social housing at any point?
Yes, so my savings are just over the amount that, and also they didn't take any notice of the fact that I have a long-term illness. So yeah.
So to go into further poverty, okay, before you're eligible to join the waiting list, is that
the long waiting list? Yeah.
And in terms of, you referred to a sense of being an underclass in the caravan park that you are living in. Have there been any tenant advice or advocacy services that have been of any support whatsoever in relation to either?
No, definitely not. I mean, only what, I can access, like Queensland wide. So there's not much, really, there's not, I mean, I really think that it's unknown that there's all these people living in this way. And yeah, and there's a lack of services, of course, in the Sunshine Coast. Yeah.
And look, finally, the Airbnb, you know, short-term rentals, for instance, you know, sometimes talked about limiting them as a solution. Do any of the three of you have a perspective on that?
Yeah,
Yes.
look,
Yeah.
yeah, you go ahead, Rowena.
Yeah, Rowena and then Rebecca.
Yeah.
Oh, look, yes, definitely. It's a big Airbnb area. It's a touristy area, and all the larger houses and better quality houses are Airbnb. So yes, that's definitely a problem.
And Rebecca, you wanted to say
Yeah,
something?
look, what I would say is, of course, that's another component of it, because if you're an investor, first of all, you're getting the fact that you can negative gear means you can always borrow more. And then now on top of that, you can Airbnb. That would even say you could even probably afford to borrow more, because you're getting even more than just your standard renter. You're getting the Airbnb person who can pay for, you know, holiday level kind of accommodation. So you've turned something that could only make you 25,000 a year. Maybe you've turned that into 150K if you're smart. So of course that's a component, you know.
Thanks, Rebecca. And Jenny, I can see your hand up.
Yeah, my experience is actually the opposite to Rowena's. Up here in Far North Queensland, where tourism is also a key sector, and I've been looking at the smaller houses. I don't want a big house that echoes around me. I've been looking for a small home. They are, unless they're real dives, marketed for the Airbnb sector. And that means the real estate agents put a higher price on them because they're looking at them as a business investment, not as a home.
Okay.
And that has been one of the actual challenges I have found. But it is a dilemma. If you own a house, a choice to make, whether you're renting it short term or long term. And I actually feel people should be allowed that choice.
Right. Okay.
It doesn't make it easier for me or you, but if this sale purchase goes through that I'm hoping goes through, I could choose to have someone come and share with me, or I could choose to rent it to somebody, and I feel that should be my choice.
Yeah.
Which choice I make.
Yeah, well, all I can say is I'm glad you are going to be in a position to make that choice, Jenny, and very good indeed. But look, we're going to need to draw it to a close unless there's anything else that anyone wanted to add. Now,
Nicole, can I just before you finish up? Look, I assume that, you know, if there would be availability sometime down the track for public or social housing that Jenny could access, but certainly Rebecca, that Rowena could access, but Jenny and Rebecca probably wouldn't be eligible for public or social housing, which creates another dilemma that they would be reliant on the private rental market. If there was an easing and there was more community housing and public housing, would everyone that's made a submission here think about that as an option?
I would far prefer to be renting than buying. As I planned in retirement, I would rent. I know there seems to be this assumption that in Australia we should aspire to home ownership. I hadn't. I just aspired to meaningful, useful work and moved routinely. You don't want to buy a house if you're going to only be somewhere for 3 to 5 years.
Mhm.
I think long-term rentals are a valid aspiration for an Australian.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. And a really important point, because that is traditionally in regional areas something that's been in an even more short supply is long-term rentals. Look, I just want to wrap up by acknowledging and thanking the three of you, Rowena, Jenny, and Rebecca, for sharing your stories. Rowena, absolutely shocking that you are one of many people, as you describe, living in tents, in caravans, in really substandard and also in many cases precarious situations due to the lack of affordable and appropriate housing alternatives. And in fact, as you've described it, it is in part because of your chronic health situation, but then, in spite of it as well, because it's certainly inappropriate housing for the circumstances that you're living in. And then, Jenny, despite being, well qualified and professional career, you have really underscored for us much of what Rowena said, but also that extraordinary situation of not being able to actually participate in the basics of life without an address. And then Rebecca, really showing to us how even people on moderate incomes in the prime of their working life, can be reduced to what is clearly an inappropriate, room share situation, and, the implications that that has for, economic inclusion, and productivity, and of course, so much more. Thank you so much. We will be thinking again very carefully about, everything that's been said to us in this session.